This presentation is entitled Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment. You see me standing here this afternoon wearing this robe, which is rather warm, I want you to know right now. Well, during the 18th century, pastors climbed in their pulpits every Sunday wearing robes just like I have on here. And they would stand before their people and they would preach the Bible unapologetically, unashamedly. They merged civil and religious liberty. In fact, they would preach from scriptures like Proverbs 13:44 that says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Or Psalm 9:17, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. They would stand before those people and literally become information central for them. Most of the people in the colonies got most of their information from their pastor. Now, the reason why the Black Robed Regiment is such an important subject in today's time is because they played a central role in what happened in the war for our independence. And what I would like to do today is share with you about some of those and let you get at least a little picture of the heritage that we've received as Americans, and for those of us who are Christians and especially pastors, the heritage that we received from the pastors who preceded us. Now I want to begin with this man, John Muhlenberg. John Muhlenberg was a pastor in Trapp, Pennsylvania, and then he had moved to Woodstock, Virginia. And he had struggled for quite some time with the conflict between the colonies and the crown. He was convinced that the crown was tyrannous and that the colonists should stand up and fight. And so Muhlenberg, after having fully persuaded himself in his mind that this is what God wanted him to do, climbed into his pulpit on January the 21st, 1776, and he proceeded to preach from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, most of you are probably familiar that Ecclesiastes 3 says that there's a time for all things. And then he read verse 8, which says there is a time of war and a time of peace. And then he did something that his people didn't expect. He closed his Bible and he said, there is a time for all things, a time to preach, and there is a time to pray. But there's also a time to fight, and that time has now come. And then he stepped out of his pulpit, walked to the back of his auditorium, and he did something that they'd never seen happen in all of the years that they had attended church in this church in Woodstock, Virginia. Because he began to remove his clerical robe. And underneath his clerical robe, he had on a colonial officer's uniform. Muhlenberg had been commissioned by George Washington to raise a regiment from the Woodstock, Virginia area. And so he stood before his men and he took his musket and he said, men, it is now time to fight for liberty. He had already preached and prepared his people for this moment. They knew what this was all about. And as I said, he walked to the back of his auditorium. As he opened the door to his church, a drummer began to play a roll, and Muhlenberg stood there with his musket urging his men to enlist. And they did. In fact, the next day he led a number of men from Woodstock, Virginia off to war. He led them for the entire war. In fact, by the war's end, Muhlenberg had become such a decorated general that he had been promoted to Major General. He led those men in battles, as you can see, Morristown, Brandywine, Monmouth Courthouse. He became one of Washington's most trusted generals and was actually honored with the privilege of being at the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. This is the famous painting in our nation's rotunda. And if you will look right over here, that third man seated on a horse is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He was a pastor who set aside his clerical robes and believed that you sometimes need to put boot leather to the Bible. And that's exactly what he did. He became representative of all of these Black Robed Regiment preachers. Today in Statuary Hall in our capital, you can see a statue placed there by the state of Pennsylvania, And notice Muhlenberg's clerical robe is hanging over his right arm, and he's holding his sword with his left. Now, this is what the Black Robed Regiment was all about. These pastors believed that civil and religious liberties are connected, and they led their people to join the fight. But it was all throughout the colonies, not just in Pennsylvania and Virginia. Now, the great historian Frank Moore, in his book in 1862, and by the way, if you really want to read about the true history of America, you generally can't read modern books. You have to go back many years. But Frank Moore said about the pastors, he said, the preachers of the Revolution did not hesitate to attack the great political and social evils of their day. John Wingate Thornton, in his book, The Pulpit of the American Revolution, published in 1860, said, the fathers of the Republic invoked God in their civil assemblies, called upon their chosen teachers of religion for counsel from the Bible, and recognized its precepts as the law of their public conduct. The fathers did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. Now notice the reversal today. Today we're being told that if pastors mix politics and religion, that is ungodly. In the days of our revolution, or our war of independence as I prefer, they believed not to mix them was ungodly. Do you see the reversal that has happened in our nation? He goes on to say, they prepared for the struggle, went into battle, not as soldiers of fortune, but with the Word of God in their hearts and trusting in Him. This was the secret of that moral energy which sustained the Republic in its material weakness against superior numbers and discipline and all the power of England. England sent her armies to compel submission, and the colonists appealed to heaven. And that's exactly what happened. Now here's another black-robed preacher. This is not a Lutheran, this is a Presbyterian. I mentioned him earlier. His name is James Caldwell. He was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Now this guy was a character. Every Sunday, Caldwell would walk into his pulpit wearing two pistols like this. And when he got to the pulpit, he would pull them out and place the pistols on the pulpit, preach. When he was finished, take the pistols, hook them back in his belt, walk to the back of the church and greet his members. Now that's the kind of guy that Caldwell was. He believed that pastors must stand for truth, not just in their pulpits, but in their communities and if need be on the battlefield. He was actually hated by the British. As you can see, he was called the rebel high priest and the high priest of the rebellion. Well, his wife was killed when a British soldier shot into their house, and Caldwell actually did his wife's funeral. Well, after the funeral, the war had moved to Springfield, New Jersey, so he jumped on his horse after leaving his children in the care of some of the townspeople, and he went to lead his men at Springfield, New Jersey. When he got there, the soldiers were running out of wadding for their muskets. Now, if you know anything about these flintlock muskets, you know that without wadding, you can't use these things. So what were they going to do? They were going to be defeated simply because they didn't have wadding. So he jumped back on his horse, rode down to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield. When he went down to that church, he grabbed 2 armloads of hymn books. He came riding back to his men, and this painting depicts it. He started throwing the hymn books at the men, encouraging them to tear the pages out and use the pages for wadding. Now in that day, a very famous hymn writer was a writer by the name of Isaac Watts. And so as he was throwing the books to them, he was yelling them, "Give them Watts, boys, give them Watts." And that's where the old saying that we use today, "Give them what for?" that's where that comes from. It comes from the Presbyterian black-robed preacher, James Caldwell, as he's throwing hymn books at his men, telling them to use the pages for wadding. So that gives you a little glimpse into these preachers. Now, because the Presbyterians of that day and time were some of the fieriest of the preachers, the British blamed the war primarily on them. For instance, King George III called the American Revolution a Presbyterian rebellion. Prime Minister Horace Walpole said to Parliament, "There is no use crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson." An ardent colonial supporter of King George III, writing home, said, I fix all the blame for these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. They have been the chief and principal instruments in all these flaming measures. A Hessian captain, writing home to his family, said, call this war by whatever name you may, it is nothing more or less than a Presbyterian rebellion. The great historian George Bancroft said this, the Revolution of 1776, so far as it was affected by religion, was a Presbyterian measure. So you can begin to see a pattern developing here. The British and now historians considered this Black Robed Regiment to be the real threat. They were actually given the title Black Robed Regiment by the British. A British sympathizer, Peter Oliver, is the one who was credited with coming up with the title. Remember, they preached in black robes. They thought, okay, Black Robed Regiment. And they considered these guys a bigger threat than the actual colonial army. Now, I talked earlier about how they didn't see any separation between civil and religious liberty. Here's a British pastor, Thomas Newton. Listen to what he says. The scriptures, though often perverted to purposes of tyranny, are yet, in their own nature, calculated to promote the civil as well as religious liberties of mankind. True religion and virtue and liberty are more nearly related and more intimately connected with each other than people commonly consider. And then he goes on to quote Paul the Apostle when he says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. You see, they understood these principles, and this is why they were fighting. Now, most of us have heard about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, right? I mean, we've heard about that for years. The British are coming. The British are coming. April the 18th, 1775. But here's the part of the story that I was never told. When I learned it, it made me mad that someone had not told me in my life. See, that night that Paul Revere was riding through the streets of Lexington yelling the British were coming, he was actually headed to this home. You may be saying, okay, well, who lived there? Well, there was a pastor by the name of Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was the pastor in Lexington, and that night he had two special guests in his home, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. His wife was cousins with John Hancock, and these two people were in Pastor Clark's house. Hancock and Adams look at Clark. There's Paul Revere sitting in the yard, and they say, okay, well, Pastor Clark, will the men fight? And here's what Pastor Clark said, I trained them for this very hour. They would fight, and if need be, die too, under the shadow of the house of God. And that's exactly what they did. On April the 19th, the very next morning, 1775, Pastor Jonas Clark and John Parker led those citizens out to face the British. There's a stone there today that marks the spot where John Parker said, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And that is exactly what happened. Now the British commander rides up to these Minutemen and he says, throw down your arms, you blanking rebels, in the name of the King of England. Guess what they yelled back? We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. And then the first shot, the shot heard round the world, was fired, and the war for our independence was on. Those men led by Pastor Jonas Clark and Deacon John Parker. When the battle was over and the smoke had cleared, a number of citizens had been killed in that melee, and in fact, Jonas Clark had 7 of his own members lying on the porch of his church who had done just what he said they would do. They died under the shadow of the house of God for your liberty and mine. Now see, these are the stories that make for the history and heritage of our nation. The problem is, though, most of us do not realize. And so as that battle raged all the way from Lexington, all the way across to Concord Bridge, when the thing was over, 49 colonists were killed, 39 wounded. The newspapers of the day talked about the brutality of the British, unprovoked. All of the efforts that they had made to not fight had, of course, as you know, come to no avail. And it was either fight or be subjugated as slaves. In fact, Jonas Clark, when the battle was over, said, from this day will be dated the liberty of the world. And in some respects, Jonas Clark was correct. In fact, a year later, April the 19th, 1776, he preached a message. In those days, they couldn't record them, so they would print them as pamphlets. These are sermons that they used to recruit soldiers for the war effort. Here's the title of that message: The Fate of Bloodthirsty Oppressors and God's Tender Care of His Distressed People. Their titles were longer than most sermons are today. These guys were serious. They weren't playing games. Today at Lexington, there's a statue commemorating those first Minutemen who stood against the British. There's a granite monument with a Bible on top representing the fact that they were led by their pastor and their deacon, John Parker. Now, this pastor, George Duffield, in 1783, referring to those pastors, said, "Quick as a flash of lightning glares from pole to pole, so sudden did a military spirit pervade those then limited colonies, nor were those of the sacred order," referring to the preachers, "wanting to their country when their civil and religious liberties were all at stake. But as became faithful watchmen, they blew the trumpet on the walls of our Zion, sounded an alarm for defense." Now that's what they did. Now what produced this generation of black-robed preachers? Well, a few decades before, the Winds Revival had swept through America in what is called the Great Awakening. And preachers were forced to go outside and hold meetings because of hundreds that would attend. Nobody had a church big enough, and so they would literally build brush arbors and preach outside. Preachers that you've probably heard of, like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Wesley, Jonathan Mayhew. These were the men that were being used by the Lord to cause this great revival that was producing, unbeknownst to them, the next generation of preachers who would be the Black Robed Regiment. See, they were planting seeds and building a fire in these guys' hearts. Now, if you think about Mayhew, he is called the father of civil and religious liberty in Massachusetts and America. He was famous for election sermons. When's the last time you heard an election sermon? Yeah. See, he was famous for these. He's the one that made the no taxation without representation famous in an election sermon he preached in 1750. He was the guy that was against the Stamp Act. He urged the colonists to unite, and his sermons and writings were used to recruit the colonists to stand up against the crown and to stand for liberty. Now I want you to think about this. There are three institutions, and if I asked most of you, you could give the correct answer. There are three institutions that God created and ordained to maintain peace and life on planet Earth. They are the family, government, and the church. You know what we're being told today? You can preach about two of those. You can preach about the family and the church, but not the government. Adrian Rogers used to say government's God's idea. It's simply inconceivable then that God would create government and then tell His people to stay out of it. Doesn't make any sense. But see, we've bought that lie, we've retreated, and we created a vacuum that the pagans and the libs have been more than too willing to fill. So we've walked away from the battlefield. We've simply surrendered. And the pastors have allowed it to happen. Now see, they had a huge influence on the founders. Look at Samuel Cooper here. He was the pastor of Brattle Street Church in Boston. John Hancock and John Adams attended his church. He was an intimate friend of Samuel Adams, and he regularly corresponded with Benjamin Franklin. See, these guys befriended the founders. They did more than befriend them. In many instances, they actually trained them. Now, here's a pastor, Reverend Jacob Duché. When Continental Congress first got together to meet, they said, well, what do we do? And a motion was made that they ought to have some preacher come down, read a passage of Scripture, and pray before they started their business. Well, one of the men stood up and said, but wait, we're all from different denominations. How could we all pray together? And Samuel Adams, who is standing right here, said, I am no bigot. I can pray with anyone who fears God and loves his country. They brought old Duché down there. He got up in front of them and read Psalm 35, which happened to be his morning devotion. I challenge you to read Psalm 35 and see if that wasn't divine, that was his devotion for that morning. And he read it to these men, and this great painting is painted from eyewitness accounts. That was September the 7th, 1774 in Carpenter's Hall. See, once again, it was a preacher. Now, notice, even here, Duché said, I consider myself under the twofold character of a minister of Christ. What did he mean by twofold? Well, what he meant was, I've got to preach the Bible, and I must also preach what the Bible says about things like government and politics. And he proceeds then, he says, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. And then he jumps and talks about civil liberty as being the same thing. He even said this to the soldiers of the Continental Army as he was preaching. He said, stand fast by a strong faith and dependence upon Jesus Christ, the great captain of your salvation. Enlist under the banner of his cross. Let this motto be written upon your hearts. Under this standard you shall overcome. He said that to the soldiers. Do you think that that would inspire them to go out there and face the British? Of course it would. Imagine what would happen today if preachers would do the same thing. Imagine what congregations would do if we just had men with enough courage to say things like this. Here's William Gordon, pastor of the Third Church in Roxbury, Massachusetts, 1774. The pulpit is devoted in general to more important purposes than the fate of kingdoms or the civil rights of human nature. But then notice down here it says, but still there are special times and seasons when it may treat of politics. What he's trying to say is politics is not off limits. My people need to hear about politics from their spiritual leader. Now here's John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was the only vocational pastor to sign the Declaration of Independence, but he was also president of Princeton University. And when they were debating as to whether or not they ought to sign the Declaration, here's dialogue that occurred. Prior to their signing it, one of the members said, "We are not ripe for revolution." And here's what John Witherspoon said in reply. "Not ripe, sir. In my judgments, we are not only ripe, but unless some action is taken, we will be rotting." Now that's a preacher, and he encouraged them then to get up, and they did. They signed the Declaration of Independence. Here's Samuel Langdon. I mean, you can just pull one message up right after the other, and you find that it wasn't just a few little hotheads. It was the preachers across the colonies. Samuel Langdon, notice here, he's not a nobody. He's president of Harvard University. He's writing a letter here speaking for all the pastors in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Listen to what he says. "It has been found necessary to raise an army for the common safety, and our brave countrymen have so willingly offered themselves to this hazardous service. We cannot forbear." Now the "we" there is the pastors. He said, "We cannot forbear upon this occasion to offer our services to the public and to signify our readiness with the consent of our several congregations to officiate as chaplains to the army." Now I want you to know that chaplains in those days were a little different than the chaplains today. Because when the fighting started, they put their Bibles away and grabbed a musket and fought. Now here's a Baptist preacher by the name of James Screven. He's known in history as General James Screven. He was a pastor in Georgia. He was a member of the Provincial Congress that met in 1775. He joined the Colonial Army once the war broke out. He started as a colonel. Later on, the state of Georgia promoted him to Brigadier General of the entire Georgia militia. At the Battle of Spencer Hill, he was ambushed and he was wounded 2 times. And while he was lying on the field dying, a British soldier walked up and saw that he was still alive, took his musket, pointed down at him, and shot him again while he was lying on the ground. See, the British hated these preachers. They hated them so much that if they caught them, they would normally execute them on the battlefield. If they could find their families, they would either throw them into prison or execute them. They would burn their houses, burn their churches. Did you know the majority of churches in New York City were burned by the British when they occupied New York? They hated these Christians because they knew that they were the reason. Well, they took his body back, buried him outside his church in Midway, Georgia. Congress erected his tombstone, and I think it's kind of interesting to see what Congress wrote. "This stone marks the spot where repose the remains of Brigadier General James Screven, in recognition of whose life and services the Congress of the United States has reared a monument in this cemetery. He was a gallant officer who, though but 28 years of age at the time of his death, had attained the rank of Brigadier General. Baptist Pastor James Screven." And I could just go on and on and on. Here's Joab Houghton. He's another pastor from New Jersey. Here's what he said when he heard about the fight at Lexington in 75. This is what he said to his congregation. This is not the men of the city. This is his church. He said, "Men of New Jersey, the redcoats are murdering our brethren of New England. Who follows me to Boston?" His men went home, got their muskets. He went and got his, and the pastor led his men to Boston and joined the fight. Are you beginning to see the kind of heritage that we've inherited? Now then, he would preach to troops from Ticonderoga to Valley Forge when they were facing the bitter winter there. But it wasn't just pastors, it was deacons from the same church. One deacon led the infantry at the Battle of Long Island. The same church produced another deacon that commanded the artillery at Germantown. I mean, over and over and over. Now, this is the one quote that I would like to read to you, though, before we get to the end of this. This is a sermon by Samuel West. Now, I want you to notice who he's preaching to. He's preaching to the House of Representatives of the state of Massachusetts. This is an election sermon. Now, this is just a portion of it, but this will give you a flavor of how these guys preach. Look at what he says. It is an indispensable duty, my brethren, which we owe to God and our country, to rouse up and bestir ourselves, and being animated with a noble zeal for the sacred cause of liberty, to defend our lives and fortunes to the shedding of the last drop of blood. The love of our country, the tender affection that we have for our wives and children, and the regard that we ought to have for unborn posterity, yea, everything that is dear and sacred, do now loudly call on us to use our best endeavors to save our country. We must turn our plowshares into swords and our pruning hooks into spears, and learn the art of self-defense against our enemies. To be careless and remiss, or to neglect the cause of our country through the base motives of avarice or self-interest, will expose us not only to the resentments of our fellow creatures, but to the displeasure of Almighty God. To save our country from the hands of our oppressors ought to be dearer to us than our lives, and next to the eternal salvation of our souls, the thing of greatest importance. A duty so sacred it cannot be dispensed with for the sake of our secular concerns. Doubtless for this reason God has manifested his anger against those who have refused to assist their country against its cruel oppressors. And then here's how he ends this. What a dreadful doom are those exposed to who have not only refused to assist their country in this time of distress, but have, through motives of interest or ambition, shown themselves enemies to their country by opposing us in the measures we have taken. He that is so lost to humanity as to be willing to sacrifice his country for the sake of avarice or ambition has arrived at the highest stage of wickedness that human nature is capable of, and deserves a much worse name than I at present care to give him. But I think I may with propriety say that such a person has forfeited his right to human society. Can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine a preacher preaching that this Sunday from his pulpit? But that's what these people heard all of the time. See, our founders understood it. Now, what changed this? Well, a number of things. Pastors have been taught their whole lives that mixing politics and religion is wrong. Some pastors are afraid of the consequences, like, they're afraid of offending their members, criticism, losing their nonprofit status. But I'm telling you why some pastors don't do anything, because they're cowards. Pastors have grown soft. In fact, Paul Blair and I have often talked about around Christmas time wrapping up these DVDs and mailing them to our fellow pastors and calling it Spinomatic, and see if we can get some of them to grow a backbone. It is time for pastors to do something. Now, I want to touch on this real briefly because I want to tell you some of the efforts that we're doing now to try to change this. This is Lyndon Johnson running for his second term as Senator of Texas. And when he was running, there were some conservative groups like this group, Facts Forum, and there was another group, Committee for Constitutional Government. They were connecting him to communism. So he said, well, I got to shut these guys up. So he was able to slip through in the Senate an amendment to the tax code, to the tax law. It's ever since been called the Johnson Amendment, July the 2nd, 1954. Here's what it says. Nonprofit entities, including churches, cannot participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of, and then this was added, or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Up until 1954, starting with the men who preached that recruited soldiers to fight for liberty, they had freely preached these things. You've seen examples. It's not my opinion. It's the record of history. All of a sudden, in 1954, did you know that there are only 2 paragraphs in the congressional record that even talk about this amendment? 2 paragraphs. That's it. He slipped it through, and ever since then, the IRS has used this to intimidate preachers. See, the problem is, any law that's unconstitutional is no law at all. And I believe the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional. I mean, read it for yourself. You know what the First Amendment says. Congress will make no law. Congress, no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And yet the Johnson Amendment does just that. Some of us have been working with the Alliance Defense Fund for the last 3 general elections. We've gotten into our pulpits, given biblical reasons why, and told our people who to vote for and who not to vote for. But the way the tax laws are written, you can't just sue the IRS. See, they have to come after you. So the Alliance Defense Fund has helped to organize us. Paul Blair and I, my friend in Edmond, were 2 of the first 33 pastors nationwide that dared the IRS to back up the Johnson Amendment by taking us to court. Now they have, well, thank you. Now, you saw this earlier. John Quincy Adams knew what the revolution was all about. He understood. It was the merging of religious and civil principles. He knew that. They all knew that. To be quite honest with you, most Christians do. I wish I had time to go through some of these things. This is one of the signers of the Constitution. He's given this speech, first graduating class of Columbia University after the War of Independence. Look what he says to the students. Remember, too, that you are the redeemed of the Lord, that you are bought with a price, even the inestimable price of the precious blood of the Son of God. Acquaint yourselves with him in his word and holy ordinances. Can you imagine somebody preaching that at Columbia University today? You can't even pray at the graduation ceremony. Here he's preaching that. Now, we started with John Muhlenberg, right? He's the one that pulls off his robe, goes to war. Well, his brother Frederick had written his and John's other brother talking about how John shouldn't get involved in politics. Well, John heard about the letter, and he wrote a letter back to his brother Frederick. By the way, Frederick was also a pastor. He pastored in Trapp, Pennsylvania also. Here's what John Muhlenberg wrote back to his brother Frederick. He said, I am a clergyman, it is true, but I am a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as to any man. Shall I then sit still and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the continent is spilling? Heaven forbid it. Do you think if America should be conquered, I should be safe? Far from it. And would you not sooner fight like a man than die like a dog? I am called by my country to its defense. The cause is just and noble, and so far am I from thinking that I am wrong. I am convinced it is my duty so to do, a duty I owe to my God and to my country. Now that's what John wrote back to his pacifist pastor brother, Frederick. Well, here's the problem with Frederick. He went into his church one morning, and the British had turned his church into a barracks. They'd thrown all their gear inside. They were sleeping on the pews. A group of half-drunk British soldiers were playing the organ, singing barroom tunes, and they'd turned their horses loose, and they'd eaten all the wheat that Frederick had planted outside his church. All of a sudden, he started to rethink this thing. Now, wait just a minute. Maybe preachers ought to get involved. And I don't know whether he saw the light, but he felt the heat, because he immediately became a member of the Continental Congress, and then he served as a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and he was the very first Speaker of the House of the United States of America. So John Muhlenberg's brother, who didn't think preachers ought to get involved, once the British desecrated his church, changed his tune. Well, to kind of wrap things up here, Samuel Adams said, if ever a time should come when vain and aspiring men shall possess the highest seats in government, our country will stand in need of its experienced patriots to prevent its ruin. Friends, I would suggest to you that that time is now. You know what Burke said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I gave you the quote of Dietrich Bonhoeffer earlier. Not to act is to act. Not to speak is to speak. God's not going to hold us guiltless, and in particular preachers. Ralph Reed said that in the 2008 election there were 28 million evangelical voters that either were registered and didn't vote, or could have been registered and weren't. Just imagine what a difference 28 million Christians would make if they would vote what they say they believe. You see, friends, we have a massive army ready to fight with us. All we've got to do is get their pastor generals to lead them. All we've got to do is build a fire under these preachers, and they then can lead this Black Robed Regiment. But let me close here with something that John Adams said in his diary when he was 20 years old. Here's what he wrote on February the 22nd, 1756 in his diary. He said, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts there exhibited. Every member would be obliged in conscience to temperance, frugality, industry, justice, kindness, charity towards his fellow men, to piety, love, and reverence toward Almighty God. What a utopia, what a paradise would this region be, whose law book was what? The Bible. Well, I'd submit to you that just a few years later, John Adams, standing right there, did that very thing. See, friends, I am convinced that it is time that we bring back the Black Robed Regiment. And I'm going to ask you if you would join in prayer with me, not just now, but throughout the many weeks and months ahead, that God would build a fire in the hearts of our spiritual leaders that we call pastors and raise up a new Black Robe Regiment that would stand up for truth and stop giving in to comfort and salary and the praise of their people, but instead would stand tough. Thank you guys for coming this afternoon. I appreciate it so very, very much.
Miss Ames, would you mind coming up here? Since we don't have a politician, you're the closest one to an official that I know of, and I do need official help for this presentation. Well, I know that, but you will certainly do as a qualified witness for this, because I do need a witness. So if you'll come up in just a few minutes, I'll get you to testify about what I am talking about. Now, of course, I am not a lawyer, and I've been accused of being a preacher, and I'm neither one. And if you, for some reason, you can't hear me in the back, raise your hand, and I'll make sure I try to get closer to the microphone. With that now, let me pick up on several questions I have for the crowd. What is the one thing that sets America apart from every other country in the world, including for the written history of mankind? Anybody want to take a guess at that? Bobby, would you like to chip in on that? Have any thoughts on that? What is the one thing that sets... Right, so it would be the acknowledgement of the Creator. Okay, now legally speaking, how many people would agree that you are under the jurisdiction or you reside in one of these jurisdictions at some time or the other? Municipal, county, state, or federal? By a show of hands, how many would agree with that statement? Pretty much everybody. Okay, we have a unity and consensus, if you will. All right, who makes the appeal in the Declaration of Independence, and to whom is the appeal made? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Short answer. Anybody want to take a stab? Sir. But who makes the appeal? You and I do, is that correct? Okay. And you, okay. All right, so now we'll go on. Okay, you are correct. This is a direct quote, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the restitute of our intentions due in the name and by the authority of the good. Now notice how that word people is spelled. It's capital. It's a proper noun. Am I not correct? That's right. And a common noun would be lowercase, correct? And it would refer to all the people. But it's a capital P. So obviously, it's not talking about you and I. So we're going to look at that just now in a minute. Is the Declaration of Independence a law? Yes? No? Don't know. How many? Okay, we got a few don't knows, and we got a bunch of non-committal. I thought you were all opinionated people. All right, so now I have right here the code book for the United States government. And Bobby Ames, does it say the United States Code, and does it look like that graphics right up there? Okay, so this would be the book that you could go into any court in this United States, lay on the table, and all parties would say, this is the reference book that we can depend on. I've asked lawyers about that, and they do say that that is true. So what is the very first law in that book? And it is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. It is a law in this country. If you'll notice, that is a little u. Of course, this was made before the Articles of Confederation, so the Union had not been formed, and so it was the very first, it is the first published document of the American people, based off of what the people did April the 19th of 1775, correct? All right. So now we have a situation where the first law acknowledges the Creator. Now let me run on through the next thing. Now, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bounds which have connected them with one another. Okay, now if you look in that first column there, you'll see people. And is it exactly like it is on the screen? Lowercase. I'm going to punch the button here. All right, now, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the capital letter P to alter or abolish it. So now we have a common noun and a proper noun. Is that correct? Okay. So now there's obviously something going on here. The average individual, and there's very few of them, even the ones that I know of, have not paid much attention to this. And it is, in fact, that we're referring to two different groups of people. The capital P people are the representatives of the people, and we are the common noun. So when you read the 4 organic laws that are at the very beginning of this book, and you see a capitalized word, it is a special proper noun and referring to a specific group of people. So if you have, as a matter of fact, if you go on to the next page and look at the top, you'll find people at large. I don't know if I have that. Okay, I do. All right, the next column, he, meaning King George, has dissolved the representative houses repeatedly by opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people. That's you and I. Next, right under that, Bobby, we have the next quote. He has refused for a long time after such dissolution to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to capital P at large. Now, if we're talking about at large, we're talking about the elected representatives who have been elected statewide. If you have a representative that's elected by district, it would not be at large. So now what has happened is that because of what the people did on April the 19th of 1775, it authorized the elected official to sever the ties with King George. Big difference about who we're talking about, because you have to understand who's making the statement in these documents in order to understand who you are. And that's a problem. We just don't understand who we are. All right, now let me go on further. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. In other words, I don't have to go into any court in this country and lay down evidence that there is a creator and he has in fact endowed us with certain unalienable rights. Now, we have elected officials that disavow the very first law of the American people, and we don't have our governor and other elected officials calling them to task for doing this. We, sitting in the pews, have to know who we are in order to exert pressure on these people that are violating the very first law that was laid down in 1776. Now, under what authority do the Americans legally reside? Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Would you say we're still under municipal, county, or state jurisdiction? Under the Creator. And here we go. This is now the 4 jurisdictions that are laid out in the legal documents. In other words, it's law in this country. We have the Creator as acknowledged in this book. Is that right, Bobby? Okay. Now, if you pull out the Alabama Constitution, Bobby, would you happen to know what the preamble says to the Alabama Constitution? Okay, so for those that are going to see this film, they're actually talking about the preamble to the Alabama Constitution. And I have the law book. This is the Code of Alabama. And it does say that we, the people of Alabama, invoke the guidance of Almighty God. Now, that is the mission statement for the state officers. For everyone in state government, their mission statement begins with, our mission statement to them begins with God. So we have Creator stated by the American people, and by the people of Alabama, we have God stated so emphatically in our Constitution. All right, now here it is graphically. You and I are just under the Creator, legally speaking. In the family, we enjoy all of those freedoms and liberties that He has granted to us, and we have created a state constitution which we stand on. We don't stand under the Constitution, legally speaking. We're standing just under the Creator's throne, standing on that Constitution. Next, we have the governors, and this is quite typically of the governors, I think. And they often act like this, and unfortunately, I think we have a governor that does act like this currently. And then under them, pecking order, folks, this is pecking order, this is jurisdiction. We have the guy on the bottom who actually thinks he's on the top. And we need to understand how to utilize the system that we have been providentially handed in order to put this proper order back into perspective. But if we don't know the order, we certainly can't apply it. So it's beginning to understand whose jurisdiction are you under, legally speaking. I'm not talking about a sermon from a pulpit. I'm talking about what's in the actual law books. All right? We have 3 United States. Would everybody agree with that? Or where is the United States? Well, that's one of them. Where would the other one be? Anybody? We got 3 of them. We're going to go through it. If you want to know the references for this, look up Hubin and Allison versus Yvette. It's a 1945 Supreme Court case, and it goes in and talks about the 3 United States. All right, here we go. The term United States may be used in one of several senses. And the first one is the United States may be the collective names of the states which are united by and under the Constitution. That would be the union of 50 states under Article 3 of the United States Constitution. It may designate the territory over which the sovereignty of the United States extends, and that would be Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 and 18. And then we have the sovereign occupying the position analogous to that of the other sovereigns in the family of nations. So when you read that document, you have to pay attention to the context in order to understand which part of the United States or what part of the legal entity you're actually referring to. This is going to become very important in just a few minutes to the issue at hand. 2 different courts have been established to adjudicate the different entities depending on what issue or controversy has been brought before the judge. And the United States District Court is not a true court established under Article 3 of the Constitution to administer the judicial power of the United States therein conveyed. I hope you got that. If you see the United States District Court, we're not talking about a court organized to adjudicate or resolve an issue between the state governments. It is a territorial court. All right, next. The words District Court of the United States commonly describe constitutional courts created under Article 3 of the Constitution, not the legislative courts, which have long been the courts of the territories. Again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. All right, the two courts are, here now it's plain English, plain as you can get. The United States District Court is the territorial court. And then we have the District Court of the United States is Article 3. Same court, same judge, same building, just a different jurisdiction. Remember, jurisdiction is not a place, it's authority over. Who's over us, Bobby? The Creator. We're just under the Creator. So when I walk through Wetumpka, I'm not really walking under their jurisdiction. As long as I bother no one, I am walking in the jurisdiction just under the Creator, and only if I bother someone or an officer of the state has seen has cause to see. Better for you to say that. All right. So now if you look at the heading on the paperwork for the district court out of Mobile, you'll see that it says what? The United States District Court. Is that Article 3? No, it's the wrong jurisdiction. And if you go to the ruling that this judge has put forth, she says that Attorney General Strange has not objected to the jurisdiction. He's in the wrong jurisdictional court, asking the wrong questions, and he's only used one Supreme Court case from 1971 for his defense. There are a multitude of cases that he could and should be using, but he's not. All right, now let me roll on to the next. Why is this important? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution. The United States exercising exclusive legislative causes are in all cases whatsoever. They have absolute authority to do whatever they want to. Now, I will say that if you go back and read the third organic law, which is the Northwest Ordinance, it acknowledges that religious and moral people are required for a civilized society. So we have in the third organic law that recognition of Christian faith, because all of these documents end in the statement in the year of our Lord. So there was an acknowledgement of not Allah or any other God, but the God of the Bible. And here we have a direct conflict now, because the federal government has seen fit in their territorial court to see whatever morality they want to. And we need to bring them back to the Article 3. All right, where is that? And where is the legislative authority exercised? Anybody know where that clause is? As a matter of fact, if you go to this section of the Constitution, you'll see a comma. And after that comma, it says 10-mile square area. But it also covers the territory, Puerto Rico and Guam, and the other places that the United States actually owns. They have all the authority to do whatever they want to. We're just not recognizing that. All right, now there's always a but. I don't care where you're looking, there's always, no, right, babe, absolutely a but. And here's one. This is another court case, and there are many of them. Except in the exercise of delegated power, the federal government may not interfere with the governmental activities of the state or dictate its public policy. Now, we voted 81% for a specific issue. And it's really not about homosexual marriage, because if the federal government can define whatever they want to that's not even in the Constitution, they'll redefine it, look for whatever issue they want to employ on us, and we'll have to accept it. This is much greater than homosexual marriage. And I was discussing at the beginning of this before the presentation actually opened up, if the homosexuals would just look down the road, they could see our foreign law is going to be next. Because we've said that no foreign law will be accepted. That would include Sharia law. So now we will have Sharia law, because the feds want it, obviously, and they can argue with the Muslims at some point down the road, and I think if they get what they want, they may not like what comes down the road from the Muslim aspects. I don't think they even talk to you. While the Christians don't like what's going on, they can't prevent by death someone from committing a sin. So I think that this aspect of this needs to be spoken to in a much more stern way, and try to, and as a matter of fact, why couldn't we reach out to the homosexual community and try to get them to understand that? You never know what alliances you may actually make that would speak to the issue and garner a lot of political influence in this particular situation. All right, now we have, there has been developed several things in the way of paperwork trying to prevent this from moving forward. Now the Southern Poverty Law Center, Mr. Cohen, and I'm sure you're very familiar with Mr. Cohen, has put in a complaint against Judge Moore for certain things that he's done. And in his complaint, we actually went and looked at what he had to say, and then there was a bar complaint written up against Mr. Cohen. It has not been put in yet, and for reasons I'll tell you about in just a few minutes. But let's go over what this bar complaint is actually speaking to. Mr. Cohen's complaint said that a judge should abstain from public comment about a pending or impending proceeding in any court. And so, of course, there's a comma, and this rule is actually Rule Canon 3A6 is what he referred to. So some enterprising individuals went and looked up the rest of this particular ethic that the judges are supposed to adhere to, and here's what Mr. Cohen didn't say. This section does not prohibit judges from making public statements in the course of their official duties or from explaining for public information the procedures of the court. So he was absolutely within his duty to explain what was going on. I mean, if he didn't explain it, he could have been charged and removed from office, in my opinion. All right, now the next thing that Mr. Cohen said is that every first-year law student at every law school in every state in the Union would grasp instantly the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution. This, Mr. Cohen contends, is simply Constitutional Law 101. Now, Mr. Cohen, a very knowledgeable lawyer, I guess he's getting paid for his knowledge, says that the supremacy clause is Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Constitutional Law 101. Well, it just so happens that Article 4 says this, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities and citizens of the several states. Ms. Ames, does that sound like the Supremacy Clause? It does not. No, it's not. Mr. Cohen has he's flunked 101, Constitutional Law 101. The Supremacy Clause is Article 6, Section 2, and here it is. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, people think that a treaty supersedes the Constitution. Well, this is unusual. Usually when I ask that question, someone always says that it does. Well, go back in history and look at the Bricker Amendment, 1953, 4, along there. And there was a Senator Bricker, I don't remember what state he was from, that could see that this concept that a treaty would violate or change the Constitution was coming into a general accepted idea. And so he proposed a constitutional amendment, and Eisenhower wrote a letter and said that's folly. We don't need to mess with that because everybody knows that a treaty cannot, in fact, violate the Constitution. It's true. It's absolutely true, and Mr. Bricker dropped his efforts in trying to get that constitutional amendment in, and I really wish that he had have done that because we now have people that are being taught that, and that would have been something that they would have had to overcome if it had actually been put in very stern language. But if you'll read this, you'll see first we have the three United States spoken of. We have the Constitution, which would be, in fact, the union of the 50 states. Then we have the laws of the United States, which would be the laws under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 and 18, and from the 10-mile square area, and also from Guam and Puerto Rico. And then we have the sovereign nation sitting in equal status with the other nations that is able to make treaties. So in this clause, you have the three United States actually talked about. Now, let me go on and talk about the other two documents that we have. We have an open letter from the people Now, what is the 10th Amendment? I'm sure you know what the 10th Amendment says. What does it say, Ms. Ames, about what two entities are named? In the 10th Amendment, we have the states and who? And the people. Two entities now. So this would be an open letter from the people that would be signed not in support of Judge Moore, but in support of the jurisdictional authority as properly understood, and that because of that, then the federal government cannot speak to the issue of marriage or any other issue that's not defined or expressed in the Constitution. Then we have an amicus curiae, had to look that up myself. It is a friend of the court brief because Mr. Cohen has put in for a review of what Judge Moore has done. It's a secret convening. In other words, everything that's done by this review committee looking at the activities and actions of Judge Moore is secret. You can't find out when or if they're ever going to have a hearing on it. So in order for us to get anything into that court, we have to give it to the judge. Now, this document has to be notarized, or should be, because in order for any of your documents from your private jurisdiction to take effect in the public or legal realm has to be notarized. So this and the bar grievance would be notarized. The open letter would not be. So now let me go on and explain a little bit about this concept of what we're trying to do. We're trying to get 3 preachers from across Alabama, one north, middle, and south. Now we have a black minister here in Montgomery that has agreed to take on the project. And we have yet to get someone from North Alabama or South Alabama, but we're working on it. We want the pastors to come and teach the jurisdiction that is applicable in this particular case and to explain each and every one of these documents to the people that sit in the pulpit. And for instance, let's say that he did have several sermons or sermonettes on what these documents are and the proper jurisdiction that we reside in. And then next Saturday, we'll have someone 10 to 2 who is a notary to come and notarize your signature to these documents. Then those preachers that had signed on to this would also attend a preachers conference. And as a matter of fact, this black minister is trying to work up a preachers conference, and we're getting up a website that would have the petition on it that you could go sign in support of the sanctity of marriage and proper jurisdiction. So by the time all these preachers get up to speed, and that may take a while, unfortunately, it's agonizingly slow for me. I think we ought to have done this yesterday, unfortunately. But at any rate, once all of this is done, the preachers would have volumes of these signed documents, not from people outside of Alabama, but from Alabamians who recognize the Creator. And they would set up a meeting for Bentley and the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, and for Senate Pro Tem to all come to a public meeting at the governor's office. Preachers would stand behind them, and they would sign the very same documents that the people had signed. And they would make a symbolic walk from the governor's office all the way down to the Supreme Court and hand all these things to Judge Moore, acknowledging the proper jurisdiction. Not necessarily sanctity of marriage, jurisdiction. And that's the main issue that we're looking at. So that's the project that we currently have going on. Now tomorrow, 101.1, you may not be able to get it in this area. It covers North Alabama. You can get it online. The 2 of the preachers, there is another preacher in North Alabama that is biting at the bit to do this. So they'll be online, and I'll be with them in the studio tomorrow, 10:45 to 12, talking about this issue. So I just talked to the black minister today, and they should have the website up and the contact information. So if you know of a minister that's interested in taking on this project, we certainly want to get this information to them. So now let me go on and just pick up some anomalies now. Remember, what jurisdiction do you reside in? Could I have right under the Creator? For an American, it's Creator. For an Alabamian, it's God. Law, not out of the Bible. The law reflects the Bible, reflects what society has actually said. So April the 19th of 1775 is, in my opinion, the second most important date in history, because you go back to Samuel, the Old Testament, He was charged with anointing God's chosen people with oil. And from that day all the way up until April the 18th of 1775, hereditary kingship, where a coalition of church and state came together, had been the order of the day. April the 19th, the people stood on the church lawn and took that first volley. They said, we'll have no king but King Jesus. Now that sounds like a very nice saying, and for a preacher in the pulpit, it's just wonderful to say that because it's heartwarming. But think about the judicial and the legislative system that all of a sudden was turned upside down and had to be completely rewritten because of what the people did in the preceding year. And 1776 was that first legal document that's codified in that book that Miss Ames has, and that's the basis for our legal system in this country. Now, let me go on and talk about some anomalies that I'm not going to explain, and as a matter of fact, as soon as I go through two codes. By the way, the Code of Alabama is applicable to you and I. Is that correct? Okay. Is it public law? Whatever. I see some people not. So it's public law. Is that correct? Okay. Miss Ames, are you the public? You are the public. I thought you were a private citizen. Okay. So, but it says the Code of Alabama. What's your code? The moral law. Your code would be the Bible. Let me back up and make that point. The Code of Alabama is written by the officers in state government, and it's their code. As long as I don't bother my neighbor, that code does not affect me. Now, the only way that code can affect me is if I harm you, you complain. Matthew 5:25 says that you should come to me and try to resolve this because we don't know what the judge is going to do when we go before the judge. But if for some reason I don't resolve the issue, you take your evidence and you go to an official of the state and you make a statement, a sworn statement to him, and then that authorizes him to come and investigate me. So otherwise, that code doesn't apply to me. I'm in a private jurisdiction just under that creator, and I expect the Code of Alabama to stay where it is, and I'll stay where I am. We don't understand that. And for Mike, for your understanding, go and read the Limited Self-Governance Act that was just enacted. It is not applicable to the private property owner, and it says so right in the document. So if you do this right now, you'll be able to lift the immunity of these county commissioners when they start violating the private property rights of the property owners in this area. So pay attention. Read that document. You need to know and understand what's going on with it. All right, let me get on to this. Now we've already said that this is public law. And this is Alabama Code 3613-5. The code commissioner, this is right under the executive branch when you read this in the code, shall have each volume of the pamphlet acts of the legislature, at each session thereof, and each volume of the code copyrighted for who? For whose benefit? It's for the benefit of the state. It's for their use. Now, is the public law copyrighted? Can you copyright a public law? Don't think so. Don't think that that's quite possible. So that ought to, now I'm hoping this, you folks that leave here start thinking about this. It's not, obviously it's not public law. It's copyrighted, and it's for the use and benefit of who? Not you and I, the state. All right? Now, 116, very important law. Acts or omissions to which a pecuniary penalty. I didn't know what pecuniary meant when I first saw it. It means money. So when we have a situation, I'm just going to paraphrase this. When we have money that goes into the coffers of the government at whatever level, it is not a public law violation. Got that? It is not a public law violation. So now in your discussions as y'all go forward from this, consider what happens when that money goes into their coffers and whether or not you violated a public law and what actually is going on within that contract or construct. Okay. Now, Mr. Mason, and this was not planned out, is going to help me go over the quo warranto. We've got something else that we've been working on. Everybody know what a quo warranto is? Bill does. A few people do. Let me explain what a quo warranto is. when the earthly king was overthrown by what our forefathers did back in the 1700s, all of the earthly authority attributed to him devolved into each and every one of us. Now think about that. Whatever authority the King of England had all of a sudden left him and went to each and every one of us. Not my opinion. That is Justice John Jay in Chisholm versus the state of Georgia. So now the king, let me go back and talk about what the king could do. He could write something called a quo warranto. It's merely a letter, a writ as it's called in legalese, and it says by what authority have you committed certain acts. And I use the example of perhaps a sheriff has sold somebody's property and hasn't got authorization to do it. So in this case, he would write, he being the king, would write a letter to the sheriff, where is your authorization for selling this guy's private property? And if he doesn't answer or can't come up with the authority, he's out of office. So in this case, we have a situation now where the district judge, not of the United States, but the United States district judge has issued an order. It's not applicable to us, and we're writing a quo warranto, a question. That's all it is, just a question. Bring forth your authority to speak to a controversy that involves a state, would be Article 3, not a territorial court. Now, if that judge, theoretically, if that judge does not respond, then the judge would be removed from office. Now, what makes this, I think, important is that the 10th Amendment names two entities, the people and the state, so the governor and the elected officials of this state should sign this document, and the people should sign it. So that's why the education component of this is so very important, is that we have preachers that will stand and speak to the authority that we have, the authority that the state has, and its relationship and jurisdictional split of the federal government, so that we can begin to assert it, and we'll have a much greater chance if we have large numbers of people that know the jurisdictional authority first of who they are and where they are, and then have the officials of the state also sign on to this. This is going to take a heavy hand to get the governor to do anything. You and I both know what kind of governor we have. He is a very weak individual. I don't think knows and understands jurisdiction at all. So we're going to have lots of men that he has stock in, preachers in the pulpit preferably, to stand and speak to this issue. Now, I'm going to get Shannon, I'm going to hand him the mic.
All right, we'll start off right here with the first line. And the word ex-rel, that means private attorney general. Each and every one of us has the authority to go in as a private attorney general and start an action when our rights have been violated, especially if it affects everybody's rights. All right? All people of Alabama in their sovereign capacity. We have all forgotten or not been taught is the problem. It's not that we forgot. It's we haven't been taught that the sovereignty of this country, the sovereignty of this state resides in all of us. What that means is we're the boss. We're the boss. And we don't remind these people of this enough. And the founders left us a system. If we understand this, they left us a system that we can start filing paperwork and put this thing back on track. But it's going to take some education. It's going to take, as Don said, some people with enough intestinal fortitude to stand up. And it's not going to be easy, I assure you. I've been in the court system myself several times. It's not for the faint of heart. It's going to take somebody that can speak fairly well, and we're going to need people that can research, that can teach other people. This is going to have to come from a grassroots effort. Everybody, we're going to have to educate as many people as we can to get them to understand this. The jurisdictional aspect of it. That is what the founders put in place. They recognized the Creator. All right, let's go on, Don. Try to get into this thing before I get started preaching. All right. We want the court to know who we are. The court is allowed to make presumptions when you walk in. If you don't tell that judge who you are, that judge is going to presume you to be under the statutes. We are not under the statutes. We are under the Creator on top of the Constitution. The officials are under the Constitution. How do we know that? What does their oath of office say? I solemnly swear or affirm to uphold or support the Constitution. Where are you at if you're holding something up? You're under it. If you're supporting it, you're under it. The people are on top of the Constitution. The officials are under it. They're our public servants. All right, so we're telling the judge who we are. We have no known or unknown contracts, licenses, franchises, classification of property, or any other written or oral agreement of any type which in any way abrogates, violates, disparages, handicaps, or limits our unalienable rights affirmed in but not limited to the four organic laws of the United States and the Republic of Alabama. We're telling this judge that we in no way are waiving any of our rights. We're reserving every one of them. Okay, unalienable. That means that a lien cannot be placed against it. Something that the Creator gave us, no man has any authority to take away from us. Our rights, our natural rights, the judges want to call them constitutional rights. We do not have constitutional rights. Our rights are not granted to us by the Constitution. They're granted to us by that Creator. All right, silence to the aforementioned is acknowledgement to the truthfulness thereof. In other words, we're telling the court and we're telling the attorney on the other side, if you don't come back and show us, if you can't prove that we do not have some type of contract or some type of license or something that hinders our rights, then all parties are in agreement that our rights stand.
Explain what happens to a 501c3 church or any entity that has a license.
All right. 501c3 has to have a corporate charter. All corporations have corporate charters. In law, if you don't understand when you incorporate, the charter encompasses all the laws. I'm talking about the United States laws. The state laws are all incorporated into that charter. In other words, if you violate one of those laws, they have the authority to take a quo warranto and pull your corporate charter. The state can do it or the feds can do it. So now you think about this. If they get this homosexual thing pushed through and the Supreme Court rules on it and they say it's okay. When a church refuses to marry a couple, the government could come in because they've broken a law. The government could come in and pull that charter, shut that church down, confiscate the property. Or the church is going to wind up in a lawsuit and they're going to lose everything they've got. We've got to get together on this. I'm talking about the black people, the white people. We all better wake up. If we allow this to come in, we just well to bend over and kiss it goodbye. On such and such day, this court was asked to review the Alabama Sanctity of Marriage Amendment, which was voted on and passed by the people of Alabama and placed in their document. That Constitution is our document. It was delineated by the mighty hand of our ancestors. It's the people's document. It's not the governor's document. It's not the senator's document. It's not that federal judge's document. It is our document. We can put anything into that document we want to. We can take anything out of that document we want to. If we need to, we can get the code book right over here and look, and I can show you where the Alabama Supreme Court has ruled on that and said it's the people's document. This court found the Sanctity of Marriage Amendment to be in violation of the 14th Amendment and therefore struck the amendment as an unconstitutional act. Okay, now we've got to come in and we've got to tell this judge where our standing is, where our footing is to come into the courtroom. The people of Alabama, here we go again. We're telling that judge, in our sovereign capacity, there's only one sovereign above the people, our Creator, and we stand under Him. We stand under Him and His Son, their grace. The people of Alabama, in their sovereign capacity, have the fundamental right recognized in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution as well as Article 1, Section 25 of the Alabama Constitution, to petition for the redress of grievance against any action taken by the state and or federal government which will result in harm to their secured rights. They have allowed two people to come in and say that the rights of the people of the whole of this state, that we don't have the right to amend our document. We've got two people that came here out of state that doesn't know and understand our way of life, has come here, and they've took those two people's rights and overrode our right to amend our document. And that's what we're going to get into. That's what we're going to tell the judge. It must be acknowledged that in seeking to vindicate our own constitutional interest, the individual in a proper case can assert injury from governmental action taken in excess of the authority that federalism defines. This is a court case. This is a recent U.S. Supreme Court case. Federalism also protects the liberty of all persons within a state by ensuring that laws enacted in excess of delegated governmental power cannot direct or control their actions. Delegated. Anybody understand what delegated means? Expressed, written down. If it's not expressly written in that United States Constitution, the federal government doesn't have that authority. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary power. When government acts in excess of its lawful powers, that liberty is at stake. Our liberty is at stake, folks. Individuals have a direct interest in objecting to laws that upset the constitutional balance between the national government and the states when the enforcement of those laws cause injury that is concrete, particular, and redressable. Our rights, the constitutional balance, has been upset here. I'm going to say it again. We've got two people that came here out of state with the intentions of upsetting our constitutional balance. They came here, filed this action, and those two people have overrode a multitude of people's rights. So we have the authority, we have the right, we have the duty to carry this in front of that federal judge and point it out. If we don't, they're going to walk this thing right on up to the U.S. Supreme Court and get a ruling that's going to be detrimental to all of us. And as you said a while ago, I thought about what you said about the hoops around the barrel. They're destroying our family with this garbage. And if I get emotional about it, I'm sorry. I got 3 kids, and everything I do is not for me. It's for these, like that little one taking a drink right there. It's for them. Thus, when the constitutional structure of our government that protects individual liberty is compromised, individuals who suffer otherwise justiciable injury may object. There it says it. We can object. We have received a justiciable injury. Therefore, the relators affirming Article 3 jurisdiction relate that actual or imminent harm is concrete, particular, and redressable to the court, to the conduct and action of the United States District Court. And here's the court case that all this came out of. See Bond versus United States, recent Supreme Court case. And you've got to understand that Article 3 is where our unalienable rights are protected. If you go into the Article 4 court, they don't have to recognize your rights. They can rule however they want to. And the doggone thing about this stuff is that most of these attorneys that have been to law school have not been taught this. They're just as ignorant to it as we were until we started studying constitutional law. All right? We're going to get into some court cases here that's going to show you that Judge Roy Moore knows exactly what he's talking about. The United States Constitution contains an enumeration of powers, there we go again, expressly written down, granted by the states to the federal government. See U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Look up Article 1, Section 8 if you want to see what powers are given to the federal government. Recognition of homosexual marriage is not there. Because the federal powers derive from such a grant from the people, it is axiomatic that the United States is a government of limited, enumerated, and delegated powers. And there's one court case, Supreme Court case, U.S. Supreme Court, holding that the burden of establishing a delegation of powers to the United States or the prohibition of power to the state is upon those making the claim. You've got to understand, our Attorney General did not pose the question to the court to say, do you actually have the power to make an adjudication on something that belongs to the states? He didn't do it. He just tried to make the argument over marriage. Look at all those cases. He just submitted one.
All right, now here's the next quote. Go ahead.
Now, I'm going to tell you something. If some little backwoods hick can find all this stuff, I think somebody with a multi-million-dollar computer and a law system set up in the State House down here, I believe they could find that. The federal government cannot exercise any authority not granted by the federal Constitution, either in express words or by necessary implication. All right, don't scroll. Look at all those court cases. The proposition that there are legislative powers affecting the nation as a whole which belong to, although not expressed in the grant of powers, is in direct conflict with the doctrine that this is a government of enumerated powers. In other words, if they're trying to assert that they have the authority and it ain't wrote down, guess what? It ain't there. Is an enabling and not a restraining instrument. Indeed, the 10th Amendment to the Federal Constitution specifies that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to who? The states or the people.
10th Amendment, folks, right there. 10th Amendment. That's why we want the governor to sign this document and why we have to sign it to submit it to that jury.
Except where the Constitution prohibits state exercise of particular powers. The Constitution limits the government to those powers specifically granted or those that are necessary and proper to carry out those that are specifically granted. We're just repetitive here, repetitive. That if it's not written down in the Constitution, they don't have it. Whenever a question arises as to whether the federal government has the right to exercise any particular authority, recourse must be had to the Constitution itself in order to determine whether such authority is found therein by what? Expressed words. In several court cases. In construing a law of the United States, it is necessary to look to the federal Constitution to see if the power is granted. But in construing the law of a state, it is necessary to determine whether the legislator is prohibited by express words or by implication either in the federal or state constitutions from enacting such a law. All right. It has been said that in the peculiar dual form of government in the United States, each state has the right to order its own affairs and govern its own people, except so far as the federal Constitution expressly or by fair implication has withdrawn that power. Look at the court cases. All right, hold on a minute now. When the American people created, a national legislature with certain enumerated powers, it was neither necessary nor proper to define the powers retained by the states. Under our form of constitutional government, what? Sovereignty resides in the people. We're the boss. We're the boss. How many people's ever worked for somebody that you walk in the morning and say, I'm not doing that. I don't have to do that. Most people that I've ever worked for, if you walked in and told them that, they'd say, you better just ease on up the road and find you something else to be doing. Therefore, the powers proceed not from the people of America, but from the people of the several states, and remain after the acceptance of the Constitution what they were before, except so far as they may be abridged by that instrument. What we didn't give them when the Constitution was written, they don't have. This principle is but a paraphrase of the provision of the 10th Amendment that powers which the Constitution does not delegate to the federal government or prohibit to the states are reserved to the states respectively. Thus, as compared with the federal government, the state governments are recognized as government of unenumerated powers. State power is regarded as reserved power rather than granted or delegated power. While the 10th Amendment has been characterized as a truism, it is not without significance, since it expressly declares the constitutional policy that Congress may not exercise power in a fashion that impairs the state's integrity or their ability to function effectively in a federal system. Moreover, the 10th Amendment is not to be shorn of its meaning by any narrow or technical construction, but is to be considered fairly and liberally so as to give effect to its scope and meaning. The 10th Amendment disclosed the widespread fear that the national government might, under the pressure of a supposed general welfare, attempt to exercise powers which had not been granted, and the framers intended that no such assumption should ever find justification in the organic act, and that if in the future further powers seem necessary, where should they come from? They should be granted by the people in the manner provided for amending that act. The maintenance of the authority of the states over matters purely local is as essential to the preservation of our institutions as is the conservation of the supremacy of the federal power in all matters entrusted to the nation by the federal Constitution. Although a particular provision of the federal Constitution may seemingly be applicable in a particular case, its controlling effect is limited by the essential nature of the powers of government reserved to the states when the Constitution was adopted. Moreover, a widespread similarity of local government conditions cannot confer upon Congress powers reserved to the states by the federal Constitution. There is nothing in the federal Constitution, and this is where we're going to point out the lack of jurisdiction to the court. There is nothing in the federal Constitution to prevent any state from adopting any system of laws or judicature it sees fit for all or any part of its territory. The federal government has no power to control the power or authority of the states except as such power may have been expressly written down, granted, or as it may be necessary to maintain the acknowledged powers of the federal government. Except in the exercise of a delegated power, the federal government may not interfere with the governmental activities of the state or dictate its public policy. What did we do when we put that amendment in the Constitution? We set the public policy for this state. We're not going to accept that here. And what have they done? They've stepped in and interfered with our right to set public policy. In the exercise of the sound discretion which guides the determination of federal courts of equity, scrupulous regard must be had for the rightful independence of state governments, and a remedy infringing that independence which might otherwise be given should be withheld if sought on slight or inconsequential grounds. Now, let's see, that's not the case that Strange used, is it, or is it?
Yes, right there. Black versus Stone.
This is the only case that our Attorney General could put into his document. A statute which prohibits marriage between persons of the same sex does not offend the First, 8th, 9th, or 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution, Baker versus Nelson. A state is fully sovereign with respect to the control and regulation of marriages for the purpose of promoting public morality and the moral and physical development of the parties, and every state has the power to determine not only who shall assume, but also who shall occupy the matrimonial relationships within its borders. Look at the cases. Each sovereign state has the right to declare what marriages it will or will not recognize, regardless of whether the participants are domiciled within or without its borders, provided that its purpose is declared in unmistakable language. If you read that amendment, it is unmistakable what we declared. The right of a state to determine the marital status of its own citizens and to prescribe the terms and conditions upon which their relations may be changed is elementary and beyond question. Thus, the legislator is competent to declare what marriages shall be void in its own state, notwithstanding their validity in the state where celebrated, whether contracted between parties who were in good faith domiciled in the state where the ceremony was performed, or where between parties who temporarily left the state of domicile for the purpose of avoiding its statute. In other words, we don't have to recognize a marriage that was done in another state. It doesn't matter whether they lived here and went and got married somewhere else. We don't even have to recognize it. Look at the court cases. Look at them. Such effect as may be given by one state to the marriage laws of another state is merely because of comity, or because public policy and justice demand the recognition of such laws. All right. No state is bound by comity to give effect in its courts to laws which are repugnant to its own laws and policy. While the term marriage has several different and relatively distinct meanings, for example, it is used to refer to the act of becoming married, or to the ceremony in which one becomes married, and to the legal contract that makes a man and a woman husband and wife. It primarily refers to the state or condition of being married. Now there's a court case that tells you what marriage is, a man and a woman. In this sense of the term, marriage may be defined as the status or relation of a man and a woman who have been legally united as husband and wife. It may be more particularly defined as a voluntary union for life of one man and one woman as husband and wife, to the exclusion of all others, for the discharge to each other and to the community of the duties legally incumbent on married persons. Marriage is a legal state of wedlock or union of two persons of opposite sex associated together as husband and wife for the purpose of establishing a family. Conclusion. The common law at the time the organic laws of the United States were created, homosexual marriage was not recognized as a lawful institution. The founders did not grant, express, nor imply the power to recognize such an institution to the United States, and without an amendment delineated by the mighty hand of the people, such recognition is not within the constitutional authority granted to the federal government. The people of Alabama, in their sovereign capacity, voted for and placed in their document, i.e. the Alabama Constitution, a provision which does not allow homosexual marriage to be recognized by the state of Alabama. Without an amendment passed by the people of the several states which grants authority to the United States to define marriage, that right is retained by the states and ultimately belongs to the people for their interpretation. With the aforementioned having been stated, the people of Alabama, in their sovereign capacity, demand that this court take note of its lack of subject matter jurisdiction over the people's sovereign right to amend their document, i.e. the Alabama Constitution, as it pertains to the state of Alabama's authority to define, recognize, and license the legal institution of marriage.
Now, the question that the gentleman had was over the 14th Amendment. And if you read the 14th Amendment, it refers to rights. Does the 14th Amendment grant rights to the citizens of the United States? Would you agree with that? I heard somebody say no. Goodness gracious, you mean I got it wrong? What does it grant? I didn't know. Well, so now we have somebody in the audience that says that the 14th Amendment does not grant privilege. Who grants rights, by the way? Who was that we said? God, the Creator. So can the 14th Amendment grant rights? No. And in fact, it says that. It acknowledges privileges and immunities of a United States citizen in the state wherein he resides. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation because he is a statutory person. Remember, he is a legal fiction that has been granted rights and immunities. Excuse me, privilege. You should have caught me on that. I don't know why you let me get by with that. After all this I've been talking up here. All right, so now he's got privileges and immunities acknowledged by the Senate. Actually, I had at one time a document, it's about 500 pages long, that spelled out the privileges and immunities of a 14th Amendment citizen. It was written in 1995 by the Senate. Well, it also, you begin to think about it, if the government can acknowledge and grant to you privileges, they have obligations that you have to adhere to. And that will be the next step. I know a lot of you know about Agenda 21, and I do have documents that came out of a South American United Nations conference that spells out the rights, privileges, and obligations of a citizen. So that's coming very closely on the heels of all this. We don't have privileges and immunities. We have secured rights. And let me go on and talk about inalienable, because you will see the two words, unalienable and inalienable. Now, Jefferson put unalienable, meaning that whatever God has granted to us, no man nor entity of man may place a lien against. And he used that in our Declaration of Independence of the 13 United States. Remember, it's not our declaration. It is the declaration of the state governments. All right, so now how many people would agree they have human rights? Anybody? What? Okay, we do. All right. Now think about that. What is the nature of man? Would you say that man is so wonderful that he has inherent human rights? No. The answer is that history teaches us that the nature of man is sinful and degenerate. Aside from striving for what the Creator has laid out, there's nothing good about us. And that's quite obvious if you just look at history. So what Jefferson did was to put in but the state's Declaration of Independence, the fact that we have unalienable rights. But when he went to France, it was the first communist revolution that occurred, he could not use the concept of rights coming from the Creator because society had already ruled that there is no Creator. And as a matter of fact, you violated the laws of France if you acknowledged a greater power, because the mind of man is where their rights came from. And he framed up and wrote the Declaration of Human Rights. Now, in order to make that applicable to that society, he had to use the word inalienable. And if you go to the legal dictionary and look up the word inalienable, it is those rights which the possessor may give away. But our rights as an American are different rights that we can't give away. And those rights are described in the Constitution as being secured. So now begin to think about this. We have a court case from 1999 that says that classification of a citizen of the United States, 14th Amendment, cannot be redefined and reclassified. And it cannot have more privileges and immunities than that of the secured rights of the created. In other words, the created cannot be greater than the Creator, no matter whether it's statutory or are our rights. So in that respect, we have a 1999 Supreme Court case that states that. We just have to make our Attorney General and our elected officials use that court case, and it's actually in this quo warranto. And when we sign it and he signs it, it should have great effect. Now, the thing about the Article 3 is that the state of Alabama, I think once they make this point, will have other states that will step in and do the same thing, and they'll be able to take it immediately to the Supreme Court. How this is going to work out, I don't know, but certainly the other side never quits. They've been working at this as long as I've been alive, and I just recently, within the past 25 years, started looking at what all's going on. So now this is coming to a head. How it's going to work, I don't know. But I do think that the remnant needs to be educated, and this is part of that education, and I'm participating in it, and I hope you will too. So, sir. Well, the question is from the notary that he was going to look at everybody's signature to ensure that their signature is, in fact, from the individual that it goes by that name or is known by that name. And this particular document we're not ready to do anything with because it's going to take a great amount of effort to get the preachers in the pulpits to latch onto this, to begin to understand it. And then if we can get enough political muscle behind us to get the elected officials to sign on to it, then we'll use, and I think by that time we'll have lots of people that will understand this particular aspect of it. This one is not. As a matter of fact, what you've read is a draft, and we have a newer version that includes that 1999 case that I was talking about. Actually, it's not in this particular draft. But the three documents that we were talking about would be, as I understand it, here for anyone's signature. Now, of course, and we've labeled them A, B, and C. A is the bar complaint against Cohen and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And from talking to the minister here today, they're wanting to hold off on that until they get enough people together that would understand what will occur when you file something against the SPLC, because they have lots of money and likely make your life very miserable. So that's why we need many people to, and I really agree with this. I think that whoever does that is going to wind up in a media spotlight and have lots of publicity that they may not want. And participating in this is going to be a strain, I think, if you get out in front. And that's one reason we wanted a coalition of pastors, well-known, that could stand and speak to the issue, educate their people in the pulpit. You know, what happened to Judge Moore last time? He wound up having to fly all over the country and explain jurisdiction. And it's unfortunate that we don't have a school system that explains jurisdiction anymore. And it's up to us. I mean, we're the remnant, and we're going to have to explain this. So are there any other questions? I kind of draw it to a close. The question is, what has to be done because they do not recognize it? Is that correct? Well, let me go back and say that in all of the documents that I've read from the various entities that are for or against and the documents from the court system, it is corporations. As a matter of fact, let me go back and talk about Proposition 8 out of California. Now, the people in California raised $36 million to put this issue on their constitution. And as this thing went forward in the controversy that ensued after that, after the people of California voted just like we did, the proponents of same-sex marriage raised the issue before the courts, and the people that had raised that money, and as a matter of fact, I read the document, they went through a very lengthy process of gaining legal status under the Code of California, not on top of the Constitution. And they made that agonizingly clear in their document when they wanted to intervene into the federal controversy that was then going on. They didn't say we're people standing on the Constitution speaking from that jurisdiction just under the Creator. They went through the whole process of what we had to do in order to adhere to every restriction and regulation to get this on the ballot. We are now a chartered corporation, and we're wanting to intervene in this controversy. They were not expressing to the court their authority. They were expressing a statutory corporate body authority, and the judge just quite literally threw them out. Now, that's why, in my mind, it is so important to state who you are. I don't have any credentials. I don't have any corporate charter. I don't have any license. I am just under the Creator, standing on that Constitution, and I expect the officers who have raised their hands, swore an oath to the Creator, who they will at some point stand before, to uphold those and protect those rights that He has granted to me. And because we think, and as a matter of fact, we have court cases that say that if you commit to a statute, you cannot assail that statute as being unconstitutional. So if we don't say in any way that we are under not only the Constitution, but under the statutes that the legislature creates, we move to that upper jurisdiction. We need to begin to understanding where we are within the structure of this society and apply it to the courts. If we don't do that, it will never be done. So, and I don't know of, as a matter of fact, we've talked to lots of lawyers. I don't know of anybody that knows and understands this jurisdictional authority that we're speaking to. You talk to a lawyer about jurisdiction, he's going to talk about in personam. He's going to talk about admiralty jurisdiction. All those jurisdictions are subdivisions of the state for the use and benefit of the state. We have a jurisdiction that was expressed only one time in the history of man, and we better learn how to reassert it because the remnant needs it.